take what was wrong and make it right. I said, baby, it's all I know, that you have out the flash and blood that makes me whole. I need your soul. So take these broken wings and learn to fly again and learn to live so free. And when we hear the voices sing, the book of love will open up and let us sing, let us sing. We can take what was wrong and make it right. I say, baby, it's all I know, that you'll have up a flash, blood that makes me whole. I need your soul. And I say, so take these broken wings and learn to fly again and learn to live so free. And when they hear the voices sing, the book of love will open up and let us to fly again and learn to live so free. And I'll be here, the voices sing, the book of love will open up and let us
Step off the train, I'm walking down your street again and past your door, but you don't live there anymore. It's years since you've been there. Now you disappeared somewhere, like outer space. You find some better place, and I miss you. Like the deserts miss the rain, and I miss you. Oh, like the deserts miss the rain, and I miss you. Like the deserts miss the rain, and I miss you. Oh, like the deserts miss the rain. Could you be there? You always were 2 steps ahead of everyone. We walk behind while you would run. I look up at your house, and I can almost hear you deserts miss the rain, and I miss you. Oh, like the deserts miss the rain, and I miss you. Like the deserts miss the rain, and I miss you. Oh, like the deserts miss the rain, and I miss you. Like the deserts miss the rain, and I miss you. Oh, like the deserts miss the rain, and I miss you. keep me moving, keep me grooving with some energy. Well, I talk about it, talk about it, talk about it, talk about it. Talk about, talk about, talk about moving. Gotta move on. Gotta move on. Gotta move on. Gotta move on. Searching for a destiny that's mine. There's another place, another time. Catching many hearts along the way. Hoping that I'll never have to say
It's just an illusion. Illusion.
illusion.
Follow your emotions anywhere. Is it really magic in the air? Never let your feelings get you down. Open up your eyes and look around. It's just an illusion. Illusion. Illusion.
It's just an illusion. In all this confusion. It's just an illusion. It's just an illusion. In all this confusion, it's just an illusion.
Could it be a picture in my mind?
Never sure exactly what I find.
Only in my dreams I turn you on. Here for just a moment, then you're gone. It's just an illusion.
Ooh, illusion.
Illusion.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next session. It will be great if you could make your way to your seats. Thank you. So our next panel will be on speculating on the present, risky encounters in school-based design education. We will have moderator Professor Lisa Grocott, professor from Monash University here in person. You have already met her this morning. And we'll have panelist Colin Chapman from Victoria Academy Teaching Excellence Program. Thank you very much for joining us. And without any further ado, please help me welcome the next panel. Sorry, my mistake. Yeah, there had been a few changes for this panel, and I missed a very important panelist that will be with us online, and I hadn't seen him in the screen. Sorry, Adam. So we'll have Adam Douglas Hill, Ambassador Blak Douglas Inc., who will be joining us online today. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, welcome. I am going to begin by pretending that I'm Kate Coleman, who is at University of Melbourne School of Graduate Education. I always get that acronym wrong. Kate obviously wouldn't get it wrong. So being Kate for a moment, Kate had this idea for this panel, where she begins by talking about this provocation to us all, that if Gert Biester speaks of the beautiful risk of education, he asks that we consider the urgency of creativity, communication, teaching, learning, emancipation, democracy, and virtuosity. And then she said that she wanted to have a discussion about whether these are the beautiful risks of design education. Clearly, what I'm about to say, I'm only saying as Kate Coleman. Hi, Kate, she's watching us with COVID online at home. And Kate said that she couldn't think of three better people to have that conversation than myself and Colin and Blak Douglas, and partly, as you will see, by our different disciplinary orientations, that she thought from the offset that that should be an interdisciplinary conversation. So Kate has structured questions for us. They're very good questions. So we are going to propose that you engage with Kate's questions rather than feel like you need to necessarily come up with questions of your own on Slido. So we're going to talk about them for a while first, and then we're going to also hopefully put those questions up for you to be able to have conversations with the people in the room and or with each other online. And so the invitation in terms of the people that are online would be that you do not need to be asking questions as if we are the three experts in the room, and to use the people online with you as people to be having this conversation with. So that's my setup. Now I'm still Kate Coleman for the next question, then I'm going to become Lisa Grocott. So Kate's first question. We live in a world marked by ambiguous boundaries between artefacts, objects, structures, systems, and processes. So what do we, the panel, think school-based and tertiary design education can do to rupture these boundaries? I feel like I'm a game show host. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to give it a lash, unless you want to, Blak Douglas.
No, go for it. You take pride and precedence live on stage.
So, I seldom know what I'm thinking at any one time, and I was very fortunate to be able to listen to the previous presentation as well. And there was some debate about whether we use one technology over another, manual over digital, and so on. And to me, it's important that they're different, and it's important that there are boundaries. It's interesting to me to consider that there are some spaces between boundaries. So we have learners that we work with in schools, and they have such a richness of strengths that they bring from their communities and from their practices, from things they've imagined, things they've experienced, and so on. But they don't experience those things in just one place or in one circumstance. They're very good at code shifting and being members of many communities of practice, and all those communities of practice have boundaries, and they like to play between those boundaries and those liminal spaces. And rather than rupture boundaries, I would suggest that we need to honour and think about those boundaries, but also appreciate that as a famous physicist, Wolfgang Pauli, said, God created solids, but surfaces are the work of the devil. And the reason he said that is because the surfaces of things are where all the interactions happen. It's where there's a lot of uncertainty about identity and what something is. And I believe that in design education, we need to be thinking about those surfaces and the way that they are able to interact with other surfaces.
I don't know why I turned this off in the middle. All right, so before I hand over you to Blak Douglas, I'm also going to say that Kate, in her email, when she thought she would be sitting on stage, was that the best panels were also people that didn't agree with each other. So I'm just going to remind you that Kate said that, and I'm looking down here at you. I don't know if you can see us at all. Can you see us? No? Adam, can you see us?
Yeah, I got.
Oh, you can see us. Okay.
Yeah,
so
gotcha.
I'm handing it over to you with the reminder that we do not need to all be in agreement. What do you think about the boundaries, rupturing them? What should happen?
Yeah, like I'm enjoying what I've tried to do with my sample images today is to strip it as far back to the fundamentals as possible. And I like that quote there about the surfaces because, going back to the primal origins of inhabitants on this continent, the only say X-plane surface was water, and it wasn't until the inception of colonisation that we experienced X and Y planes based on geometry to create architectural structures. And it's a fascinating quote, that one. So there's no doubt who is the devil here in present day compared to origins of First Nations inhabitants on this continent and in terms of dwellings. When I peruse these questions, this first question certainly jolted something with me that's been troubling me for, I could confidently say, about 15 years now. And if you wouldn't mind bringing up my image number one. This is what I often present to kids in schools through my workshops in schools nowadays as one of the foremost, the lead-in images in my PowerPoint presentations about disbanding stereotypes of Aboriginal art. And so this is the very first page of your generic Aboriginal art search today. So if you are to Google on your phone right now, Aboriginal art, this is the page that comes up. And this poses a drastic problem for the emergence of left field contemporary First Nations artists. Artists like Yanni Scarce, Destiny Deacon, Carla Dickens, Jason Wing, Megan Coop, myself, in terms of trying to escape this hideous stereotype that we've been adhering to for the last 35 years in what constitutes what is Aboriginal art. And the interesting thing and the ironic thing about these images here, most of these are the most contemporized versions, which are obviously painted for a tourist market and have become even more bastardized to end up on every new jersey for the NRL Indigenous round or the Sydney Swans jerseys or whatever. And so what I'm alluding to here is that this is the dilemma that I see that begins in primary schools when an Italian Australian primary school teacher is given the responsibility to teach art in a Christian or Catholic school in Fairfield in Sydney, and knows nothing about Aboriginal art. One can download a government distributed PDF from the Education Department website, which will teach you how to paint U-shaped figures sitting around a concentric circle campfire and squiggly lines of tracks leading into the area. And that still exists today. So it's not simply, I guess I'm starting with the Mexican wall, the Trump wall, in terms of breaking down the boundaries of what we have to address in teaching First Nations education in curriculum.
What I really like about that is that I thought when you began that you were sort of angling in specifically about practice, and you were almost thinking more in a curriculum way of like how the, subjects at school, and then you kind of wove it back into both of those things. And my son literally was doing that curriculum you described just a few weeks ago, and he was not excited to be doing it. So I agree with how challenging that can be. I am no longer Kate Coleman, I'm now Lisa Grocott, and I'm going to say that my response to this question, it was funny when you started thinking, because I was like, excellent, I totally disagree with you. And I was thinking that it's because I think I always lean into like wanting to rupture boundary, like it just was so funny to me that it's just such a knee-jerk reaction of like not wanting boundaries, which sort of I think runs through, like you can kind of see how that plays out in my career. So listening to you be thoughtful about that liminal space, was kind of gave me pause, right, to sort of rethink the what I was going to talk about. And then you used the word honour for something. Was it honour the liminal space? And what I had written down in my notes was to kind of honour the ambiguity. And I thought, maybe it's not, we're not that far apart. It's like the thing I was thinking of with my practice is, the words Kate had put down was like about, structures and systems and what other words does she have? Objects, artifacts. And I was thinking that for me, if I'm got a process of co-designing, I'm using artifacts as convivial tools to make visible a kind of oppressive system, that brings about kind of structural oppression. Like, there's just nothing in, there's no value in me teasing out that this is artifacts, because the artifacts aren't the end product, they're part of a process, and the process is to reveal, the structures within the system, it just doesn't feel useful to tease those things out. And yet maybe the bit that you and I are sort of in agreement on is that sort of slippage of how do you see that that's what you're doing and sit with that kind of liminal space. And then your point, I think is distinctly different, right, of what happens when it's almost like a temporal notion of boundaries, right, and obviously a colonial one, but this idea that the way that things, what it takes to shift thinking over decades, and what you have to get out from underneath, right, to shift people's perceptions, because there's boxes, that they're kind to put practices into, and which obviously education, is also doing. So, sorry, I'm going to keep looking at you as the education person. Does anyone have any follow-up points to that question? Should we move on to the next one?
There we are.
Ready for the next one?
So it's interesting to me about these spheres, and I really appreciate the comments about art in particular. And I do notice, and people will be able to see, that if that one of those images has got a scale underneath it that measures the image in inches, and that's a curious thing to have with an art piece. this idea of being a practitioner is so important, and it's not something that one can pretend to. You have to enter into community with others while still knowing that you're an outsider in a way. And there's Simone Weil makes a really important point when she says that in order for us to be attentive to the practice of others, we need to suspend our own imagination so that we can be really washed over by the imagination of other people. And it's a really humble way of engaging. It still appreciates that there's a playful space, but that we need to not just back off physically. We need to be there physically present, but we need to keep our imagination in check in order for us to be able to experience the imagination of others. And to me, that's an important thing to think about when we're considering this topic, which I don't believe has an answer in any case.
Any follow-up comment? No? All right. Okay, so here's Kate's second question. This one's a long one. With accelerated climate change, the fragility of our planet is becoming more and more apparent. We see persistent inequalities, social fragmentation, political extremism that are bringing more societies to a point of crisis. What do we need to teach to create possibilities and opportunities for new ways of knowing about the world? Do you want to go first this time, Blak Douglas?
Yeah, sure. I guess there's no better example to use here than my third image, if we may, technical officer. And that's obviously the 2022 Archibald Prize recipient. And there's it was pretty evident from the delivery point of this painting that it was a hot favourite to take out the prize because it couldn't have been more timely and topical. It just ticked so many boxes for what a portrait can achieve, and at this particular time, and the importance of the way this is resonating with the general public, the fanfare it's achieved in Lismore, where Carla Dickens is based, and also how this is reaching the kids is something to behold, and it's just about become the probably the most studied artwork in certainly the modern history of the Archibald. As I see, I'm constantly getting feedback from teachers in schools en masse, and it's it was beautiful to see the kids' eyes widen when talking about the metaphors in the piece. And I guess just to start with my kind of omnipresent flat bottom clouds that are a metaphor for federal government in all of my paintings. There's like a false ceiling in the sky. And in this case, they were created with the hues of grey. It's a dark and kind of War of the World imposition, if you will. And it distinctly meant to represent in this painting the Morrison government and a lacklustre addressing of the crisis for the people of Bundaland country. But down to the buckets, and the buckets kind of a double entendre in the sense that when I saw images of people trying to, in desperation, trying to bucket water out of their lounge rooms or out of their bedrooms, to pretty much no avail, but what else are you going to do? You just have to keep trying to do this. And so the flip side of the metaphor in these buckets is the commission that commercial dealers take from the artists today, which is 50%. for your high-end galleries, your blue chip galleries. But of course, painting a 3-metre canvas in this sense enabled me to get 2 metres of water. So there's literally to that water line up the top is 2 metres. I'd never painted an image with such focus and such direct reference to a distinct crisis in climate change. And so the slight little victory, personal victory that I experienced at the launch of the Archibald Prize was on the evening, was that Ben Franklin, the State Minister for the Arts, he gave me a big bear hug and proudly announced that he was a Lismore boy. So the way this painting as an artwork resonated with him almost brought a tear to his eye, and it enabled me to get into his ear a little later on and just say or question, what are you going to do for the artist of Lismore? And so what I felt would become the dot on the I, pardon the pun, for this artwork, after all of the accolades it's received so far, is that the Minister will put a bona fide effort towards injecting some funding into the arts community, which is a very strong community within the environs of Lismore, and just to appease people's mental health strains and get them back on their feet with their art practice.
Thanks for sharing that story, because I feel like in its entirety you kind of worked through, obviously the politics of, what's kind of happening metaphorically in it, but even the way that you describe, going back to how Kate set this up, the sort of urgency and the fact that this was the first time you kind of sat with a specific crisis, and then your story of the opening and even what that afforded, right? Like obviously the success of it ending up in curriculum and teachers and students engaging is one thing, but also this, conversation that you get to have. I wondered if you see, it seems like you almost knew in the moment that you were doing something that you knew in its kind of urgency and relevance would be prescient, but is there a sense, going back to Kate's question, was there a risk? Did there seem some beautiful risk that you were making, or did it feel almost like compelling and it just had to be done? Like, I'm wondering is there a risk?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know what? I'd like to say that what I did state when I won this prize was that you get to this point to win the biggest art prize on the continent, and I guess in comparison to Grand Slam tennis match, we train ourselves to produce a product, and so I felt this incredibly humble experience where, I've trained my right arm and my hand to be able to technically produce an image that conveys a message, but in the bigger scheme of things, when I won the prize, it was the exact same time that the 4 planets aligned. And if we look outside of our own molecular being and our position in the universe, that has a greater resonance and a representation of why something can happen for an individual as a minute speck down here on this planet. And so I was kind of trying to convey that to the many corporates that I was speaking to as a responsibility with the Art Gallery New South Wales, which was some 17 occasions. And I was just wanting to see which person amongst the suits might have had an inkling of a spiritual understanding of where I was coming from. And thankfully there were a number. But interestingly, if I was to play my cards correctly, as I've observed the machinations of the most contested art prize in Australia over the course of the past 5 years as I've been a finalist. I would not have ever thought of painting a politicised image, and particularly an environmentally politicised image, because I've come to learn that most institutions on this continent would rather steer away from any kind of abrasive politicised message. But as I said, this just was too on the money, too timely right now, and that's generally what will take out that award.
Yeah, I do think there's something really interesting there about the risk that often feels like the bigger you kind of swing in some ways, right? Like the times I think I've done the riskiest gesture educationally, because it might be something I might not normally do, it is often kind of received in such a different way. It's like, I guess the ways that we constrain ourselves because we have some story of how, things happen out in the world, right? That there was it was almost like you didn't have a choice but to do this, and then of course that same thing that guides you is guiding, the reception it's got from the kids and the different ways that people are engaging with it.
Exactly. It's pretty much. It's like focusing an old SLR camera, particularly a rangefinder, and so when you achieve the focus, ready to click the shutter, that's how I feel this painting arrived. It was coming distinctly from my heart. My mind had the nous to instruct my extremity to produce the imagery in the way I wanted to produce it, and then everything just shazams.
I just had that deja vu feeling. Go.
To me, this is a beautifully risky image, and when we've contemplated that with students, it's been, well, the risk is not knowing how people will respond, and some responses we've had are the image seems to be quite narrow, and if you turn too quickly, you'll miss it, right? It could be almost fleeting, right? So that's not even in the image, it's just the dimensions and the way it presents. And other ideas students have come up with you want me to solve this crisis, and all I have are these two buckets, and that's almost despair.
Wow.
And to try to enter into the world of the learner in that circumstance can be quite tricky, because you almost need that despair in order to be a little bit of an engine room towards thinking about or speculating about a possible future or a possible idea. Other learners have thought about, well, maybe the questions are the things we need to focus on rather than a solution, because this image has got a person who's very open and vulnerable, right? Their arms are turned out and so on, and towards us. So it's risky because you don't know how the response is going to go, and you don't know how you're going to react with the world of the person who's having that response. And in a teaching circumstance, you have a multitude of responses. You don't just have a single one, a unified one. And we like using art as stimulus, and part of my background is I teach mathematics and physics as well as system engineering, but we use art as a stimulus and to evoke a response, and also to put us all on the same footing with respect to being vulnerable to something. So that's just it's a wonderful image for us and for learning.
I kind of love the idea that there's, from your position as the artist, there's this interesting thing of like feeling kind of compelled to do it. The risk is, like you say, making a kind of doing this political piece maybe when that's not what you've been doing. But there's something about the kind of paradox there in taking almost this very specific position, talking about these floods, talking about Lismore, but then embodying it in this way. And then, like you say, the millions of interpretive responses that kind of affords in the classroom that opens up a different risk, right? Of like, now you've got emotions in the room that need to be talked about. And then it brings back to me that kind of washing of imagination, term you were using before. There's just something about that idea that this individual work kind of journeys into these classrooms and through the children's imaginations in really different ways, and then kind of asks, as that connects to the systems thinking and the other things, like brings up different questions. And I think the point that I was reflecting on with this, I'm Lisa Grocott again, is this idea of how at least we have a perception, and what you just described doesn't fit into this box in a good way. But it can seem to me like that the constructs of education can get in the way of that expansive thinking, right, of the being able to want to make connections between things. And so the idea when you're talking about using, art as a stimulus in these, 4 other disciplinary, school contexts, to me is what seems kind of inspiring, because, in the keynote this morning, we were talking about this idea of solutioning as if it was inherently kind of problematic. Whereas I think to me the thing about solutioning, going back to Kate's original question about the fragility of the planet and the inequalities, etc., the idea is that it feels like we're often educated where we're showing up with the kind of hammer-nail type idea, right? Like, I have a solution to this situation. And it's the carrying of that solution to something that I think is the kind of limiting aspect of that. And so if when I was talking to Carol Gosam when we were preparing for our keynote this morning, she had this excellent story where when we were talking about this idea of if you always think that the solution as an architect is the building, that what that brings, and obviously my area of design has similar kind of constraints. And the story she told, I had a way lamer story about this person that just suggested that instead of having an air bridge between 2 buildings, you could just have a bucket with umbrellas at either side, and the architectural practice not liking that story. And her story was someone that needed I think I'm getting this right, Queenslander house, but they needed a ramp for the elderly parent to get upstairs, and but the slope of the ramp meant that they needed this ramp that was kind of around all 3 sides of the house, and it was a super ambitious project, and to get the incline right. She used more architectural terms than I am. And then she sort of told the story that the more questions she asked, she was like saying, well, is there, what ability does the person have? And they were like, yeah, they can use a walker, they can do some walking, but they just can't take the walker up the stairs. That's why we need the ramp. And then she was like going, or we could just have a walker at either end of the building. And it was like on the ground floor on the top. And she said that was fine. That was the only solution that was needed. And so it's like, to me, Kate's question sort of gets to more like how, in what ways in the world can we break down the sort of idea that this education is giving me some disciplinary orientation and more make sense of the world in this sort of just completely interdependent way all the time. And for some reason the word authority has come up a lot today, and it often seems like it's a authority of a discipline that's being kind of held on to, and I just sort of wonder what that looks like to be able to bring a more Indigenous perspective of the interdependent kind of systems that we work in ways that then we aren't trying to make sense of our disciplines of like what part we own and what part we're expert in, and rather than this sort of more collective framing of what it is that we bring. And I was just examining a PhD yesterday, so I'll try to give these person's names right that they were citing. So it's Ehrenfeld and Hoffman, and it was this idea of these theorists talking about the shift that needs to happen. So this is not an Indigenous perspective that they're offering, but the shift that needs to happen is for humans to shift toward viewing themselves as beings of care instead of beings of having and needing. And I just thought there's something kind of radical, in that idea of what it would mean if we were not, bringing what education often does, right, at higher education and in school, of the, what is the kind of knowing and expertise I'm being credentialed for and performing, and more like, what is my relationship to caring for the planet and its people? And it just feels like it's a kind of radical suggestion, but what would that ask of us in a world where that was the kind of frame, was how I took Kate's question about the large-scale challenges we were facing. Did you want to jump in, Colin?
Yeah, there's so much to think about, really. It's so we know Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," and that seemed to almost be an information capitalist version of being. And then Simone Weil came along and said, "I can, therefore I am," which was really about people constructing meaning and being part of knowledge formation, I suppose. And then Hertzinger comes along and brings up the idea of homo ludens, the playing human, and that effectively I play, therefore I am. And play is such a present and place-centred idea, and it doesn't take long to look at the official curriculum documents that are out there, and there are a lot of verbs in there that are really talking about this idea of playing with ideas and making, right? Being homo faber, as Hannah Arendt would say, the person, the maker. The words in the curriculum documents, and they're deliberately there, are such words as develop, which is a really risky invitation, because it's not about a teacher saying, here is the fact of similar triangles, here is the fact of reference frames in physics. It says develop, and the idea is that the teacher must work with the learner to take risks in trying to find ways to understand. That's the riskiness that's embedded in the curriculum as it is. In fact, if you don't take those practices, you're not teaching according to the curriculum. If you're just giving the facts, that's impoverishing what the possibilities are. So to me, the risk for us is to allow this playful frame to happen into, well, not allow, I shouldn't say that really, it's the playful frame should be something that's celebrated in order for us to develop understandings. And part of that is to take the risk of encounter with artworks such as Blak Douglas's artwork, or a multitude of different artworks from different areas. Artworks that are provocative and also allow a deep contemplation and a deep reading, and invite a suspension of one's imagination while we try to get into the imagination of another thing. So to me, that's play is the riskiness. Now, one comment we do get from students, and it's not necessarily stated, it's this idea of just a helplessness, because sometimes we challenge them to solve global warming, punkt, right? And that's so disempowering. Peter Murphy and myself, we worked together this year along with other providers, and we ran a program with our master teachers on urban agriculture, right? And this idea of gardening as being a profoundly revolutionary and emancipatory practice, one that somebody can be involved with and see change. And they can scale the garden up, they can go to a community level. What does that mean with respect to interacting with others in the community? And start building up relationships with different communities of practice before they go and tackle the United Nations, right? And to me, that's a way that we can still have risk, but also risk that can be rewarded by people developing an intention as to what their action could be, and then being able to interact in a way that they can get immediate feedback from their local communities.
Colin started talking about play now, that's all I want to talk about. Maybe I will circle back to play, but yeah, I think for me it's so interesting. I don't know what your take would be on this, right? Because obviously you have a far more in-depth understanding of that, sort of K-12 space with learning. But like for me, the playfulness as a sort of affective experience is so much more than, like the words in the curriculum, and the teachers' capacity to be playful themselves seems to me like part of it. Like, I wanted to ask the question in the previous earlier panel today of, like, how do teachers show up as learners in the classroom? Like, how do people see them as learning? And I've recently been working with these play researchers from Denmark, and it just, the thing that kept coming up all the time, it's all, Denmark's like very good at play. Pedagogy is sort of one of their signature things, but, they kind of really focus on it even at a still young age. It's not like they're not trying to do playful curriculum at high school. They're not trying to, they're just trying to get teachers to teach play to young kids. And what it seems to me that so much of it is like the ability of the teacher themselves to be playful, right? And then creating an energetic space of play is very different to the stuff that gets written even into assignments and things like that. Like, my son the other day was talking about why he loves drama so much, and it was such a great paradoxical answer. He was like, oh, it's the only class I don't have to pretend, which just seemed so brilliant, right? That it's like the only class he thinks he's just showing up as himself, right? Because it obviously feels to him like an expansive place. Maybe this can lead into the next question, which was, if great design translates into meaningful social change, what roles does the design and design education play in addressing the major societal issues facing the world? So this is obviously kind of an extension of the previous question, but yeah, specifically this idea of meaningful social change. What's the role of design or design education? Shall I go first? I could go first for a change if you want. I've got slides for this one, I think. Do I have to? Oh, can I have my slides, please? So for me, the setup for this one is that I do think that the idea of kind of systems change orientation is the useful kind of boundary rupturing or honouring the liminal spaces in between. I think that it calls for a kind of transdisciplinary approach. I just would call for a type of systems change that was one that places relationships with the kind of messiness of humans and the vitality of non-humans and stuff in the system. And I think that lots of the failings of system design, is when it kind of tries to operate at a quite cognitive the behavioural sort of level of understanding of the world. And like Peter Senge and Donella Meadows, when they would talk about systems design, they would also acknowledge, right, if you've seen that sort of iceberg thing, or the idea that the kind of work that can have the greatest leverage is this sort of like worldviews and mindset and the people's fixed perceptions of the spaces that we feel like that we can't step out of. And so this idea of how we kind of shift worldviews and mental models has kind of been the focus of my research. But even though it feels very particular, I still would see it in the scope of a larger systems change project. And so for me, the connection here that this diagram is kind of speaking to is just the idea of how we would understand what it means to try to do transformative learning. And so the idea that this is learning that's got to actually be really disorienting, that it has to be able to surface the kind of assumptions and beliefs that we're already kind of being guided by. How is it experiential, but how is it envisaging different futures? How are we allowing new imaginations to kind of emerge? And this sort of co-realizing, experiencing alongside each other, right? So that I can even see that your lived experience is different to mine. And then ultimately, how do we create rehearsal spaces for these new ideas to kind of be settled? And so for me, I don't expect you to read the text here on the side. I'm just sharing these. I've got an image that has a website for this that you can look at the end, and so these are all Leris diagrams on the website that you can download and use. But this idea to me of surfacing scripts is just one part of the things that I think are about transformative change, but I think surfacing scripts is the part that I feel like architecture and design spend the least time kind of attending to. I think that we're very good at envisaging new futures. I think we obviously do kind of learning through doing, and in a Fitbit way or whatever, designers can be very good at setting intentions and like giving people techno-rational kind of beliefs that they're kind of following goals. But to me, the surfacing scripts is like it's almost like part optometry script, movie script, programming script of like, these are the ways that kind of show how we see the world, how we act in the world, like the way that we kind of show up, and yet they're all just so oftentimes, invisible to us. And we certainly kind of go into a classroom just accepting, normalizing lots of things that, that we just can't even call out to be true. So, Blak Douglas, when you were giving that example of like, when you wanted to talk about the planetary alignment to the suits, and you were wondering, is anyone going to receive this, right? Like, can I walk in with this different way of understanding, or sharing a kind of different knowledge system in a space where understandably you thought that might not be received, and then you were kind of pleasantly surprised, right, that there were some people that could step into that framing that you were giving them and kind of meet them there. And that's sort of my experience of this work, is it feels risky to do. It feels risky to do a keynote this morning where I talk more about my personal story than it is to talk about other people's positions in the world, but it's often kind of received differently because it's a very, kind of relational way of showing up. And so that would be my take on how meaningful social change could happen in design education. But do either of you want to jump in about that one?
I think my microphone's still on, so I'll have a go. I'm all for revolution, and all for students. We talk about agency in education biz, and teachers often talk about giving agency, and I just rail against that because I think students should be seizing it, and we need to be provoking ourselves with the sorts of things that we might try to explore in the classroom, so that we all have an opportunity to seize the moment and to play with the ideas and so on. It's my first design experience was up the Arts Centre Spire just down the road, where I unfurled a banner with a colleague from University of Melbourne that told the US to get out of the Northwest Cape. And when we came down, we thought we'd be celebrated, but we were not very welcomed by some elements of the peace movement, especially the non-aligned, non-violent peace movement. And it was interesting because we thought we would just go and do this protest, this activism, climb the Arts Centre spire, throw down a banner, and everything would be wonderful. But we came to understand that there's a design process in that sort of activism, and we needed to work together with a broader community in order to be able to situate that protest in a way that was meaningful for more than just the two of us up there, right, hanging by ropes. We needed to work with the broad community with respect to disarmament and nuclear war and so on, but also with the police and also with the state and so on, because we needed to design our protest, our intervention, so that it could be responsive and be able to be responded to by a diversity of people, not just the two jokers up on the spire. This is, to me, it's important that we talk about civics in our schooling and appreciate that civics isn't about learning the rules of how government works. It's about how one interacts with the world and designs a response to what one sees in the world. And it's a profoundly important design process because it is a very heated space, and it is a space that's very difficult to see the results of your, in which to see the results of your action. I do come back to this idea that it's important that we scaffold our approaches to students being active in their communities in such a way that the interactions begin at a level that is quite tangible, where they can learn skills that can be scaled in the future. And it's important that they see that if they're negotiating some conflict or some resolution or some response at a classroom level, there are different things you would do if you're going out into your local council and making this, some sort of arguments for change. And then what changes might you need to make to do it at a different level, a different community and so on. To me, that change is very risky, but it does need to be scaffolded, and it needs to be something that students can seize and take control of beyond what the teacher expects.
It's so interesting, even just listening to you use the word change as, I guess, like the kind of action, or as my kids' school use the word innovation for their, classes, right? Which, I totally get why they're doing that, but it's like, it's activated in completely different ways, right? Like if I understand that these subjects I'm doing could be seeding change versus the idea of it being kind of framed through innovation, yeah.
And the word change suggests also that the thing that I think I'm doing could go wrong. It might not go to plan, right? And that's such an important aspect to design thinking, right? It's part of it's a part of the feedback loop, right? So often students think, when they think innovation, they think about very successful innovators whose ideas seem to have always worked. Whereas those who are thinking about change, they're really invested in something happening which may or may not get to where you want it to, no matter what your intention is. So change allows people to think differently about that process. And again, it's not just about making products, it's about interactions with communities and so on.
Yeah, it feels like immediately more prototypical to the extent that you almost have to put things out into the world to see, to sense how that's kind of being read, right, in a way that I could imagine innovation happening supposedly more in the classroom. Do you have another follow-up point, or do you have an observation you'd like to make about what design education needs to be doing, or shall we move on to the last question? Blak Douglas?
I just had this random little recollection. I guess my role here is to offer the suggestion that fundamentally, as I've realised my ultimate place as an artisan in this modern world, on this modern continent, is that I am ancestrally responsible for acknowledging not only my ancestors, but the peoples from the countries that I'm residing or traversing at any given point. And so something's been chipping away at me since we've been discussing the curriculum and whatnot. And particularly after having a portrait as a finalist 2 years ago of Duane Hewson, the iconic 14-year-old at the time, who's the star of In My Blood It Runs, the documentary by Maya Newell. And what I'm alluding to here is that curriculums are, by and large, fundamentally a Caucasian construct. And so there's an incredible scene in that documentary where Duane looks straight down the barrel of the camera and asks, when am I going to be able to go to a school that speaks my language?
Yeah.
And as an Aranda boy from the desert, the epic scene features a Caucasian school teacher, female school teacher, who's trying to read a Dreamtime story children's book to the kids who are all tribal kids from that region. And she mispronounces a word and apologizes, saying, I don't know much about this culture. So I'm going to fast forward to a design point of view, just to lay the boot in as where I come politically with my art. Near a decade ago, I was producing a mural for Ashfield Council in Sydney, and there was a inclusion of an image of a Ballerini Qantas jet, which was a John Moriarty design through his company Ballerini. And so I reproduced that image and including painting the Qantas logo. Now, I was told to remove that logo because Qantas is so sensitive with that logo. And even back then, when I was obviously not as politically savvily tuned as I am now, the penny dropped and I thought, wait a minute, you're a Dutch designer who won that logo contract, has plagiarised an Aboriginal totem to produce what is now the most famous airline image that we have. And here's a Dungari boy being raised in Western Sydney on Darug land, of which the dominant totem is Buru, which is the kangaroo. And I'm going to be chastised for using his design of kangaroo.
Yeah, it's all there in that one story. Yeah, I was shared this morning that I had, for my undergrad honours thesis, I had tried to do a project that was around trying to explore the cultural appropriation of Māori motifs in design in Aotearoa. And the story I told was about how my white examiners wanted to fail the work because they had no way into understanding the work, and I think it's the point of, like you giving the example of the teacher trying to read the language to the people. It's like it's an easy story for me to make fun of the examiner's inability to have a way into understanding it because they only had their way of looking at it, right? It was like it wasn't graphic designers. They knew it. They couldn't assess its form. They couldn't assess its, like the virtuosity of the design in some way, that I was proposing a completely different way of working, and it was a process, and it was a way of kind of showing up, and it was a way of consulting, and they didn't know what to do with that. And so it's interesting to me that it wasn't explicitly that it was Māori content that they wanted to fail. It was the not speaking the same language, right? There was just like that disconnect of, and in that situation, I got to have a Māori examiner in the room to facilitate that, right, on my behalf. But how that gap of that experience for people, like if I hadn't had a Māori examiner in that room, I would have failed. I would never have gone on to grad school. Like my whole life would have been, completely different, right? But it's that idea of the translation and the kind of gap of that seems like it would just keep coming up again. Of how the challenge of negotiating that, which will also not be solved in this panel discussion, but your story of the appropriation of the appropriation of the appropriation. I'm going to ask the last question. We have like 10 minutes left, and I would like you guys to have a chance to talk since we have not done the Slido thing. So the last question that Kate had is a very specific one, which is like, what would you like to see school-based and tertiary design education do to teach and learn with country, culture and place? So we've obviously already begun talking to this question. I have a slide as my answer to this question, and then I will stop talking. In going through that work of thinking about what transformative learning was, as I talked about in the keynote, the thing this morning, it was like, for me, the transformative learning was definitely located in this idea of the Indigenous lessons that I had kind of learnt about learning decades ago. But what I also found interesting was this way that different disciplines were using the word relationality, right, or in relation with. And for some disciplines, some fields, academic fields, that idea of relationality was just person to person. And I started to think of what I had privileged in my work, like what was I in relation to. And my work was very much sort of about this kind of sensorial, haptic, embodied, play-based kind of way of co-creating with people. And so in this diagram, I was really looking at, people, body, emotions, and senses that this was what I was in relation to, and I had not been designing, I had not been, a relational kind of orientation for me had not specifically been to country. But then I work in a research community where I could look at other PhD students that would have said that their work was absolutely about, ethics, politics, and culture. And for other people, it was systems, technology, and place. And it was like this really useful way for me to see that collectively we were tackling really similar questions, but we were using these different sort of relational dimensions to explore that work. And so this is, I'm not going to talk anymore. I've talked too much. But, this for me was the provocation wasn't that anyone would be able to work across all these dimensions, but if we could be honest about the dimensions we were engaging with and what it would mean to have done. So if my whole orientation to transformative learning had been through some of these other dimensions, how would that have shifted my practice? Was just a really interesting question for me. I'll leave it to you. Do you want to go, Colin? What would you like? Did you have something? Sorry, were you pointing to Blak Douglas?
Yeah, look, I'll go back to my experience of working with children in schools for the last 20 years across the continent, running workshops, and often witnessing the teacher's jaw drop when I often begin my presentation or my workshop reminding the kids about the fact that this is stolen wealth, and that to reciprocate any form of that tentative word reconciliation, we must attempt where possible to revert our language and specifically acknowledge the fact that Australia is not an Aboriginal word and it's a Latin-based term. And obviously, depending on which school you present this information to, as to how proactive they are for First Nations sovereign achievement, you're going to get a mixed bag of reaction and in some form opposition. And so in the space of only 235 years as perhaps the second youngest colony on the planet, and the last bastion for the Caucasian race to be dumped, we have to be reminded that we've reduced thousands of languages and dialects to around 50.
Yeah.
And yet we still kid ourselves that we are all meant to come under the one Commonwealth banner of identifying us as Australians in inverted commas. So what needs to happen is the fundamental stripping back to the bones of how we actually formally introduce every session and every class that we are presenting. Because, let's face it, any given class, be it a primary school class or a kindergarten or a tertiary lecture, is a ceremonial practice. And so here we are as a modern society and a modern community, getting very caught up with ourselves and our accolades and our academic achievement, and very easily simply forgetting the very path that we've just led from our personal home to the campus, and we've crossed to neighbouring Aboriginal countries. And so there needs to be a reminder, just as we were force-fed scripture on Tuesday mornings in primary school and had to stand up for God Save the Queen as it comes through a little mono speaker above the blackboard, every class should begin with an acknowledgement of the fact that this is not in fact Australia. This is an Aboriginal country that belongs to such and such nation that you're standing on, and it's part of a multi-nation continent. And so this is why I'm often asked, why can't I just paint something nice like a still life arrangement of flowers? Why do I have to keep twisting the dagger with my political comment? Because I can't sleep, I can't wake up until I see this change in the grand dichotomy of our sight.
Kia ora, thank you for saying that. That's great. Colin, do you want to add any last comment?
I don't think it'll be the last. I think, but the language is such an important area, and I know that in Aotearoa, the increasing importance of Māori Te Rawa, and it being not just a language that's taught, but a way of thinking and an idiom that's experienced, and it's actually incorporated into school life, where students share not just the language but connection to family and to land and so on, has been quite successful in Aotearoa. It's something that I know that there are groups working on in the Australian context, and the language is interesting too, because there are so many, as you say, Blak Douglas, there's so many thousands of languages here, and people often say that there are dead languages, and that's not quite the case. It's just the language is sleeping, right? And it's awaiting an awakening, and not just simple usage, but living in the language. And as you said, part of that living in the language is living in country, and the multitude of meanings that country is encoded, right? So that's something that I still need to grow to appreciate and to live and experience and encounter, and it's a risky proposition for me, especially in my day job as a teacher.
Yeah, I like you acknowledging the risk of that. As those of you that were here this morning, I always try to introduce myself in te reo, and I have this, it makes me so much more nervous because it's such a harder thing to go on stage and talk in those opening minutes in that way, and yet there's a commitment to the discomfort that brings, and the honouring that I'm even allowed to do that when my ancestors weren't allowed to at all, feels an important gesture. So we have talked for the whole hour. I don't think it's necessarily an invitation to say that you could talk for 1 minute and 30 seconds, but I am going to put up, this just looks like I'm now promoting myself. That's not what I was going to put up. Sorry, I thought it had the website. I think the website is just designingtransformativelearning.com. Anyway, if you want the diagrams, they were there. But no, there are not the questions. Anyway, if you remember Kate's questions and you would like to discuss them in the break that we have before the things, that would be my encouragement. They were great questions for us to sit with. And, there they are. So yeah, if you would like to continue the conversation amongst yourselves, that would be brilliant. I would like to thank Blak Douglas for joining us online. It's a difficult gig to do from afar, so thank you for doing that. And Colin for joining us on the stage, and Kate for making all of this happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a great panel. So thank you for attending day 2 of the Future Design Research. We shall now have a 30-minute break before our final session. We'll have our keynote towards the certainty of uncertainty with Professor Theodore Spiropoulos, Director of the Architectural Association Design Research Lab, and also the Practice Minima Forms. And it will be followed straight away by a roundtable discussion. The session will commence at 5 p.m. Note that you do not need to re-register at the registration desk for this session. Thank you very much.